And today we're going to dig into stakeholder management strategies. And this is going to be a little bit of a more of a structured conversation. We've pulled together some research and some best practices from across the industry and from a lot of leading thinkers in the space. And we'll share some sources with you, as well as talk through some approaches to building a stakeholder management strategy. And then at the end of the month, we'll also have a workshop where we'll work together to put some of these things into practice with you, into play with you, and help you build a toolkit to succeed and lead in your own organization and in your own career. So with that being said, let's get started. I want to get started. I want to start the conversation today, actually, by just talking about the concept of stakeholder management. And as product people, this is not a new topic for any of us. This is something that we've all kind of dealt with in various ways in our career. Some of us come from project management backgrounds and have had extensive project management training where stakeholder management is a core skill set of the project manager. But I think there's a fundamental difference in the stakes and the approach to some of the details of stakeholder management that product managers have to take a different lens than most other professionals in the business. Not to say that one is more important or superior to the other, but product management has some uniqueness to stakeholder management that's important to consider. So let's look at a product-focused definition of stakeholder management. And this is pretty common wording that you've seen some variation of this somewhere in your career. This isn't new, but I want to kind of ground us in a common definition. The stakeholders can either be people or groups of people that have a direct or indirect interest in your organization or vice versa. And specifically, they're people that have an interest in developing or delivering the products and services of your organization in one way or another. Another way that I've seen it said is that stakeholders are anybody impacted by your product. Now, our conversation today is going to center on internal stakeholders versus external stakeholders. And by internal stakeholders, there's even a different set of definitions that you can use in a project management world. Internal stakeholders are literally the stakeholders that are directly involved in your project in some way, shape, or form. They are part of the team. External stakeholders are people outside of the team. In a product management world, that's where I think the first difference really comes to life. In a product management world, your internal stakeholders are your stakeholders within the organization, and your external stakeholders are those outside, like your customers, like industry analysts, like partners. It's your internal. So we're going to focus most of today's conversation in this series on the internal product stakeholders that you work with on a day-to-day basis to fund, build, and successfully launch products. That's how we're going to kind of line up our focus on this for today. Okay. So to kind of start off that conversation, does anybody else? I just kind of want to jump in. I see some virtual finger snaps and claps out there. Does anyone else have another definition that they've used of a stakeholder that adds some additional flavor to this, or that they really like the wording of that you'd like to share? So think about that for a second. And I'm also going to ask everybody to think about the strategies that you use for stakeholder management. I'm going to walk through kind of 5 strategies and have some discussion around them today, but they're not the only ones out there. I found literally dozens of approaches that guide stakeholder management, and kind of distilled it down to some of the common ones that I think resonate the most and can and are specifically actionable that we can kind of take away today. First of all, any other definitions of stakeholders that anybody particularly likes, throw your hand up real quick, and I'll give you a couple seconds. And if not, we'll move on. Drink some coffee. All right, so let's jump into the strategies then. first strategy it comes down to the notion of being proactive versus reactive. And I've actually had a lot of conversations about this recently with quite a few people. And so it's really kind of resonating as a timely conversation for me as well. And understanding who your stakeholders are proactively is a key skill of product management leaders that really succeed and grow and have influence within the organization. Too often, what I see, and John, you can probably back me up on this because of the amount of coaching and teaching that you do, stakeholders become apparent when there's a problem. When somebody has said, oh, something's not working here and I've got a voice in this and I need to raise my voice. Is that right? And I see Jackie nodding her head vigorously there as well.
It's that, and when there's another agenda.
Mm-hmm. When there's another agenda that's not on your radar. Absolutely. So the very first strategy when it comes to expert stakeholder management is not waiting for those stakeholders to surface, is to take a proactive approach to mapping out, finding and identifying all of your stakeholders. And there are a few tools out there that can help you do that. But the simplest thing to do is to, as a product manager, map out every single department in your organization, inside your organization, every team, every department, every function, and build a good old-fashioned RACI diagram, a RACI matrix. Who's familiar with RACI, by the way? RACI. You can use your virtual hands. See, we got so for those who aren't familiar with RACI, it's a tried and true project management tool. Actually, it's a matrix where you literally take each of your initiatives, or in our case, as product managers, products, and each of your stakeholders, and assign each of those stakeholders, each of those departments, a single letter. Are they responsible for an outcome or for a product or for something related to the product? A, are they accountable for it? Usually as a product manager, you're going to be carrying a lot of the responsibility and or accountability depending on your level in the organization, but you're also going to have some development team members and some design team members that are heavily responsible and accountable. You're going to have C for consulted. I got some YMCA going in there. Thank you, Holly. You got C for consulted are the groups within your organization that you need to specifically solicit input from as you are building out your product plan, as you are preparing to go to market, as you're preparing for launch. Who do you need to not only communicate with, but get input from? And I is finally the informed, and the I group doesn't necessarily have influence over the process, but they need to be aware of what's happening, and you need to make a very clear delineation of those roles. And from there, and then there's a final category. You can leave groups off of it and just say that they're not involved in this at all. They don't even need to be informed, and that's okay. But you want to make that explicit decision, and I recommend doing that from a group or team approach. From there, you can then begin identifying the individual human beings within those organizations that need to be your points of contact to represent those groups as your actual stakeholders. Usually your leadership is going to be in the accountable group. So if you're an individual contributor, your manager or your vice president or your CPO is going to be that accountability group because they're going to be responsible for the outcomes. They're going to be accountable for the outcomes, even if you're responsible for getting the work done. Making those clear definitions is really useful. There is a downside to it, though. The RACI matrix is a really useful tool, but there are a couple of scenarios where it's not actually a good use of time. And one of the things to keep in mind is the definitions of those individuals, the RACI, they're very stringent and they don't leave a whole lot of room for variability. Someone is not a C and an I, they are a C or an I. There is no in between. And so sometimes that can create, that model can lock somebody into a pigeonhole and create some blinders. So be careful of that. And the other thing to keep in mind about the RACI matrix is, depending on the length of your effort, the duration that you expect to spend on it, the time of the effort, it may not be worthwhile to go to that extensive of an effort for a specific product initiative. You're generally going to want to do this at a portfolio or at a scope of responsibility level, so that you've got a stakeholder group list and a stakeholder understanding that spans a long period of time and a large budget effort that is going to survive beyond the next few weeks. And that brings me actually to one of the other distinctions between the project management approach to stakeholder management and the product management lens of stakeholder management. Project management, stakeholder management, is specifically focused on stakeholders for the duration of a time-bound project. They will be stakeholders on a project for a limited period of time. When that project ends, it is no longer the same relationship. Their stake in the project functionally ends. Product is different, because well-run products follow the course of the entire company. They live for years and years and years. Now, some products will be sunset and will end, and the stakeholders will change in your RACI matrix as a product approaches end of life. You'll have different relationships with different groups of people, but functionally, the product stakeholder matrix lasts much longer than a typical project stakeholder list would. And that's a huge difference, is just the duration and longevity of the product management approach to stakeholder management, and why we have to think of it a little bit more strategically than you would in a short-term tactical project. And then the other piece of that first strategy is really about identifying and prioritizing stakeholders. And prioritizing is a whole different beast. How do I decide when I identified stakeholders that I need to consult with, that I need to inform, and who are accountable and responsible? How do I prioritize which ones I spend the most time with, and how do I build that communication plan? And you can't be a product manager for more than 15 minutes without being confronted with a 2x2 matrix. There are a billion 2x2 matrices, and we're going to look at another one right now. It is called Mandelow's matrix. And I don't know if you've heard of this, and you may have seen other variations of it. This is actually the original approach. It was written about in 1991 by Dr. Mandelow, and I can't remember his first name right now. I think it might have been Max, actually. But and he was doing a lot of writing on stakeholder management, strategic stakeholder management, and he came up with this matrix that says what you should do is you should plot all of your stakeholders as you've identified those individual names that we talked about. Plot those stakeholders on this 2x2 graph. The two axes are how much power do they have to influence your product or your effort. Do they have veto power or not? Do they have strong influence on people who have veto power or not? And then what is their level of interest? Do they care? Should they care? Where do they exist on that spectrum from low to high? And as you do that, as you map them relative to each other and plot them on this 2x2 matrix, you'll end up with 4 groups of stakeholders. And you have some that have a low level of interest and low power. Those are generally the ones that you're going to keep informed, and you're going to not spend a whole lot of time. You just exert minimal effort in making sure they're kept in the loop to the necessary degree, but you don't need to spend a lot of energy managing those stakeholders. You're going to have some that have high power, but a low level of interest, and you want to just make sure that they are staying satisfied. They've got enough information to have confidence that they don't need to develop a high level of interest. Or if you need to move them into a high interest category, you need to do the work to move them into the high interest category. But you can be very clear that folks in the low interest, high power category, you have a communication strategy for keeping them satisfied and comfortable with the product status. High interest, low power, you definitely want to keep them informed and up to date, but you need to recognize their position on the matrix. And then there's the most important category, which are the key players. They can shut you down, they can increase your funding, and they care a lot about the product that you're working on, about the initiative that you're working on, about the outcomes that you're driving towards. So one of the key elements of effective stakeholder management strategy is building a proactive list of your strategy, of your stakeholders, and creating this matrix and identifying where each of those stakeholders lives on that matrix so that you can build an explicit communication plan for those key players and for the other players that's appropriate to their role and their position on the matrix. Does that make sense? Has anybody who has not seen this before? Is this your first time seeing this this matrix and this approach to stakeholder mapping?
The second one, yeah. I'm seeing the second one for the first time. I have always been working on RACI, but this one, something new.
Excellent. I find, I love 2x2s because they're fast and easy. And I don't know a single product manager who says, I got all the time in the world. I can spend all my time documenting this stuff. Hey, Jason, you're telling me I got to document another thing? This is fast and easy. You can do it with Post-it notes on a whiteboard. Now, if you're a premium member or if you want to join our workshop at the end of the month, registration will go live for that soon. And we're going to actually work through this exercise together with your own stakeholder map in our workshop at the end of September. So if you want to join us for that, we'll get the announcement out so you can block the time on that soon. Jackie, you got your hand up.
Yeah, one reason I love this over the RACI is because people have a really hard time understanding RACI and mapping to it. This is a lot simpler, more straightforward. I've seen a lot more success with it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's good feedback. I've heard that one as well. That the RACI definitions can be a little stringent and difficult to understand. Am I consulted or am I informed? I don't know. Which should I be? And there's also like 15 other variations of RACI as well that try to address that. And so then that gets even more confusing. I like the simplicity of this.
Totally.
And just know that this group, you need to have your key players, you absolutely need to consult and keep well informed. And then there's kind of various levels for the others. Allison, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, in my experience with the 2x2, that's more of an internal tool, whereas maybe the RACI can be shared broadly, like everybody understands who's doing what and where.
Yeah.
But maybe depending on the nature of your product or your organization, that 2x2 is I believe, who needs to know and who needs to be involved, because that could create some drama or rifts depending on your organization.
That's a good call out. I also like the two. I like that you use the word internal, because there can either be internal, it's just for my private use, but it's also a great workshop tool because you can move people around and say, okay, well, is Lisa more important than John in terms of their power? Does Lisa have more power than John or less power than John? And let's kind of agree on where they sit on the spectrum. And then you got the high and low. Soumya.
I also was thinking when you were talking about stakeholder management and like the consulted and the informed area, right? There seems to be always some kind of a conflict when it is only a product organization versus a product and services organization. Because when you have a product and services organization, services people speak a little louder, they seem to bring in all sorts of enhancement requirements. If your product manager is not paying attention to, if you have a product roadmap, they are like, all is fine with your product roadmap, but what happens to this customer? We are going to lose a big deal. So the same RACI chart can look completely differently for a product organization versus product and services organization. I don't know. I have to try out the second one and see how it would work.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a great segue into kind of the next strategy that I want to talk about. And this should be very natural to all of us as product managers as well. And it's really around understanding the motivations, the influences, and the triggers of your various stakeholders. And if we go back to the matrix there for just a second, and we think about the key players here in quadrant D down here. If I want to think about them for a moment and think about who do I need to spend time with, I'm going to interview my internal stakeholders as much as I interview as well as interviewing my external customers and my external stakeholders. So I'm going to set up, as part of my communication plan, I'm going to set up some either one-on-one or group interviews. And those key players are likely to be one-on-one interviews, those high power, high interest individuals that are going to have strong opinions that I need to capture their input. I need to understand their perspective, and I need to build that into my planning and prioritization. We'll talk about prioritization in just a minute as well, on your product as well. And then there are those that you want to keep informed. Your interviews there and your consulted group, your interviews there can vary between large group interviews and discussions. Like my Keep Informed group, I would frequently do internal roadshows on my roadmap where I'll go work with our support team and say, here are the things that are coming in the next release and the things that we're working on beyond that. So I'm keeping them informed. I'm getting a little bit of feedback on that from the group, but I'm making that a quarterly exercise, and I'm talking to 20, 30, 40 people at a time. And but then your Keep Satisfied group, your C group, you might bring into smaller, more functional groups where you can get some information about some common concerns, some common questions, and some common issues to include into your thinking. And then your minimal effort group probably just gets a recording or a distribution, a blog post, an email, just with kind of the status update and what to expect in the near future, unless they start to become higher interest, in which case you need to start managing them a little bit more explicitly. So that's kind of building that. But you're going to interview, especially these key players, you're going to explicitly set up some time to work with them on their priorities, understand what motivates them, what are their triggers, what are the things that are going to cause them to raise their head. And somebody said just a moment ago, I think it was Allison that said it just a moment ago, these are the ones that you specifically want to, it was John talking about, there may be some other issue, some other initiative, some other factor that's not on your radar. So the conversation with these key players is very much like the conversation we have at the beginning of Product Coffee every week. What has your attention? That's a powerful question. It's open-ended. It really lets them expound on the things that they're worrying about, and you can understand how your product fits into the what has your attention landscape so that you can pursue that discovery in a more appropriate way for each of those stakeholders. John, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, as I listen to this and read between the lines, and I'll give you guys an example of this. To me, I think so much of this stakeholder management comes back to, 80-20 rule. It's the two key things that we are tasked with as product managers, which is understand what's valuable to the market and why it's valuable, and then be able to articulate the benefit back to our own business, right? So that is such a huge part of our job. So back when I was early in my product management career, I'm sitting in my boss's office, who's the director of product management, $500 million company. Our CEO just happens to mosey into Nancy's office, and just, he was one of these straight to the point guys. He said, we need to change the roadmap around and put this thing on top. And Hallie was something equivalent to what you said earlier about some new AI thing, whatever it was in the day. And our CEO was not the guy you wanted to get on the wrong side of. So Nancy looks him straight in the eye and she goes, we're not going to do that. And I'm thinking, I'm going to get out from in front of this fan because I know what's about to hit, right? And so he goes, what do you mean we're not going to do that? So she came back with two things. She said, if we do that, here's what we're not going to deliver to the market, right? And here's why that's valuable to the market. And here's the impact on the business in terms of our revenue and retention and some other key metrics. And this turned into about a 45-second conversation. He looked at her and he goes, you're right. We probably shouldn't do that. So somebody did an end around on product management, got the CEO's ear, and got them all lathered up about something without understanding the ramifications to the business. Right. And that this happens to us as product managers like every hour of every day. Right. And so I think, when we start to look at how we influence these stakeholders in some way, shape, or form, I think it always comes back to those two things: is our ability to articulate what's valuable to the market and why it's valuable, and then the impact back to the business.
Yep. That's A, love the story. B, absolutely dead on connection with the reality of it. So thank you.
I was thinking, is John reading my mind secretly?
Well, as part of his sponsorship, he does.
Powers.
As part of his sponsorship, he does get a direct brainwave feed of all of our members. So just don't tell Jeff that he's getting that. Excuse me. So, getting back into that strategy. So we're going to interview each of our stakeholders, and we're going to, or especially, but we're going to prioritize that lower right quadrant, those key contacts for those one-on-one deep dive discovery question marks. We're going to understand what's driving their own priorities and their own focus, and what other initiatives they've got on their page. And that gets to, and that whole line of discussion, John, also gets back to one of the things we'll talk about more next week in the difficult stakeholders discussion. Is it's very rare that difficult stakeholders want to be difficult. They do exist. There are hippos that are hippos on a power trip. They absolutely exist in the marketplace. But more often than not, the reason there are difficult stakeholders is because we're misaligned. And our job as product managers is, in addition to driving requirements and being the voice of the customer and creating alignment with our engineering team, it is creating alignment across the organization, ensuring, I would even say more than creating alignment, our job is ensuring alignment across the organization, because it may at any point be us who has become out of alignment due to some initiative that we didn't know about that has critical implications to the company, that is very well discussed and understood at the most senior levels of the organization and hasn't filtered down to us yet. And having these touch points, these deep dive regular discussions and meetings with these key stakeholders will help to uncover and surface those sooner, so that we can respond to them with less disruption and alter course as needed in a responsible, validated manner. And so, and that brings us to the next one, and we got to about 18 minutes left. So the next one is around creating transparency. And somebody spoke about this a moment ago: understanding, explaining why I'm making the decisions that I'm making, why I'm prioritizing things the way that I prioritize them. And this is key to the stakeholder management role, because too often, what happens in roadmap discussions, in delivery discussions, in meeting discussions is we communicate a list of priorities, but there's something of a black box to many of the stakeholders in the organization as to why those things are priorities. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the difficult stakeholders conversation next week as well. I'm thinking about a sales organization. When I sit down with the VP of sales and talk about the things that are coming in on the roadmap, in the next 3 weeks, in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months. And there are two ways that my sales leader can receive that information. One is say, okay, now I understand the truth. I understand what's going to happen. Thank you for informing me. But let's remember that this person is actually already a person who's kind of one of our key people with a great deal of influence. They're driving revenue into the company. They have high interest because their paycheck is directly impacted by the performance, by the products that we bring to market based on the response that we have. They've got insight into customers that is very real time, because they're having those yes/no conversations on a daily basis with customers who are choosing to buy with us and not buy with us. So they've got insight. And making sure that we have alignment in how prioritization decisions are being made is a key strategy for product managers. A couple months ago, we did a workshop on building a strategic priorities framework. And if you missed that, we have that available inside the recording is available for our premium members. And if you'd like a sample of one of our workshops, you can reach out to me directly and I'll get you a link to that workshop so that you can watch it for yourself. But we talked about creating a specific model to identify your entire organization's strategic priorities and build a framework for determining your own product priorities that's very well rooted in both the strategy and the customer voice and the technical priorities that you may have, and using that as a framework to discuss why you're doing what you're doing with your organization. With anyone in your organization, with your stakeholders. So whether you use a RICE type of a prioritization tool, or you've done a Kano study and identified some differentiators that you need to bring into your product, some delighters that you need to bring into your product, no matter what your methodology is for prioritizing, make sure that your stakeholders understand what that methodology is, how you're making decisions. And when there's disagreement on the priorities, you can then drop back, instead of arguing about the specific priority, you can drop back to understanding how the approach isn't serving the needs of that stakeholder, and how that prioritization approach could evolve to better serve the needs of all of your stakeholders. Or you can, and you've also got the tool to create, as we saw in the Building Your Strategic Priorities Framework discussion, you've got the tool to actually create agreement in why we're prioritizing things the way that we are, and shine a light on the fact that this thing that seems like a high priority to one specific stakeholder actually is just very interesting, but it isn't the right thing to be focused on just yet. So creating transparency into your approach is a strategy that product managers need to really manage. It's part of those regular discussions. Don't just tell people what the priorities are, lead them in understanding why we're doing what we're doing, and be open to the discussion of, is our why the right why? That's where priorities really change. And I saw this, so any thoughts on that one before we move on to the fourth strategy? Yes, John. And you're still on mute. And you're still on mute.
User error. So back to my early days as a product manager, to your point here about the transparency of everyone knowing what you were doing. One of the things that we had, it was in place and we did it on a regular cadence. I wouldn't even call it a customer advisory board. We would twice a year invite representatives from our current customers that represented our markets in to talk about what was important to them, why it was important, the kind of things they're dealing with, right? Just business requirements at their best. And we would communicate that out to the rest of the company. And the reason we would do that is, number one, to inform them, but to let them know what the backdrop was for how we prioritize things. And I'm not going to say that, you know, we certainly didn't have people who didn't agree, but boy, I'll tell you, it went a long way around people understanding what we were doing and why we would say no to things. Because, you know, you would sit there, people go, well, why aren't we going to do this? And the response was, you know, we thought that was a much higher priority for our customers. And then when we talk to them, it's like, no, it was further down the list than we thought. So, you know, you can't listen to 25 customers that represent your target market and go, no, they're all wrong, we're going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. But it really helped people understand how we prioritize. And I mean, it was enormous in terms of helping people get on board with what product management was doing in terms of our prioritization and the overall roadmap for the portfolio.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you. The So anyone want to add anything else or ask for any clarification? And like I said, if you'd like to see that session and kind of get a feel for what we do in the premium workshops, feel free to send me a link and I'll send you a recording of that session. You can check it out for yourself. All right, fourth strategy. I was reading a blog post by Roman Pilcher. I don't know if a lot of you know him. He's one of the old hats around product management, thought leadership, since when product management started emerging on the national stage and the global stage back in the early 2000s and mid 2000s. Roman was one of the first voices writing prolifically about it. And he has written a book, drawn a mental blank on the name of it, but it's like leading from product management or something like that. Leadership strategies for product managers. And one of the things that he specifically called out that I think a lot of us do, but don't necessarily think of it through this lens, is forming a stakeholder community. And this is about collaboration. And there's an art to collaboration when you're talking about forming a stakeholder community. But what he specifically proposes and suggests is doing things that I know a lot of you do because we've talked about it and we've done workshops on this, is actually holding collaborative workshops with your stakeholders to dig in deep into common themes, into common issues, so that you're creating not only that one-on-one relationship with your key stakeholders, but you're also creating product-centric relationships between those stakeholders and a community around the efforts that you're facilitating. And that enriches the overall conversation. It allows people to explore each other's perspectives, gain a greater appreciation for prioritization and some of the details because they're seeing other perspectives. Excuse me. And frankly, it makes work a little bit more fun a lot of the time if done really well. If you run an effective collaborative workshop, it makes work a lot more fun. Just showing up for those. I was in one last week with a client of ours, and we were working through prioritizing a bunch of work that they've been thinking about for a long time, and just having that structure and the exercises and the conversations that they were able to have versus just a brainstorming session on a whiteboard. They walked away and said, the structure around this made this task that I have been dreading really fun. And facilitating those types of workshops, or having someone facilitate those types of workshops, and bringing together a community of stakeholders to solve those problems, or to move or to shed light on problems and opportunities, is a really powerful strategy for, once again, going back to that one of those core roles, creating and ensuring alignment across the organization. It really expands the field of view of everyone involved, including yourself. That's strategy number 4. And you'll find I forgot to send everybody over to the notes document at the beginning of the session. Some of you knew to do it. Did anybody in here remember to go to productcoffee.com/notes this morning? Oh, I forgot to remind. Oh, Allison's in there. Is there anything in there? I hadn't even looked. All right. Well, we'll get the transcription up on the page. But if you go over to productcoffee.com/notes, there is a notes document that I usually encourage people to take collaborative notes on these sessions with. And I dropped in there a list of articles that I found really relevant, that has some more detail on a lot of these techniques. So that's there for you. And if you look at our events page at productcoffee.com/now, you'll see our landing page for the specific event. There's also a link to that document and some reminders about what the topic on this session was that you can look at and share later. And the last strategy that I want to land the plane with, and it kind of brings all these things together, there is an important notion of setting boundaries. And this is one of the ones that's a little bit harder because the right boundaries are going to vary from group to group. One of the things that we do hear about and talk about a lot, and we'll talk a lot more about next week when we talk about difficult stakeholders, is how much is too much. When you have that hippo that comes in and says, this is the way we're going to do things, this is the priority that needs to trump everything else, if you're doing these other 4 strategies, if you're executing on these other 4 strategies, you've got the leverage to say no when it's time to say no. And, Steve Jobs has been widely quoted on his fundamental premise that one of the most important jobs of innovation and strategy is saying no. In order to do that and have it received well with stakeholders, you have to have good relationships. You have to have strong relationships. You have to have professional relationships. Bowing up and yelling, we're going to do it my way, is not the way to do that. But setting the right kind of boundaries means setting frameworks with how stakeholders can get things done. I have a request, I have a need. When we've executed on these other 4 strategies, identifying and prioritizing our stakeholders proactively, understanding their motivations, their influences, and their triggers, creating transparency as to how we make decisions, and creating stakeholder communities to actually dig into these things as groups and ensure alignment across the organization. It's very easy to start pointing those stakeholders, creating those boundaries and saying, this is how we're going to work together to be successful as an organization. And key leaders, the best leaders, not only know how to say yes and get things done, they know how to get the most important things done and facilitate the most important conversations while listening to identify hidden motivations, influences, and triggers by setting good boundaries and setting frameworks to have effective conversations going forward. So set those boundaries, say, great, this is when we're going to talk about that next initiative. We've got a time set aside to talk about that initiative, and here's where it is, and here's how we're going to do it. Or we have an approach for talking about that. It sounds like we need to get a few people together and discuss this. Let's do that. Even when it's the top person, even when it's the CEO, if you're having those regular one-on-one discussions and understanding the emerging issues, then you've already got a working relationship that you've planned the foundation for, like Nancy had done. You've got the trust, you've got the impact and the influence in the organization. Say, no, here's how we need to handle that suggestion that you've just made, that recommendation, that approach, that mandate that you're putting down. Here's how we're going to respond to that. And so setting those boundaries comes on the back of doing all the foundational work at front. When a difficult stakeholder emerges, when a challenge emerges, and that's when you set the boundaries, it's too late. And that's when you start getting into political discussions that can derail an entire career. So let me just share with everyone here, and there is a deck here as well that you've got access to. I think it's in the notes. No, it's going to be on the archive page, actually. So our premium members will have that at the end of the episode today. You can log into your account at productcoffee.com and go to the content menu, and you'll see our slides, which has all the content that I shared with you today. But here are your 5 stakeholder management strategies. Identify and prioritize your stakeholders. Understand the motivations, influences, and triggers. That's through deep interview. Just like you do customer discovery, you're going to do stakeholder discovery. Create transparency with your stakeholders so they understand how things are being done, why things are being done, and there is no black box for them to wonder about. Form a stakeholder community so that you can create and facilitate that alignment throughout the organization, become known as the person that is ensuring that we all stay in alignment. That propels your career forward. And if you do all those things, then it's a much easier task to set boundaries into how we're going to work effectively as an organization and lead through that filter as well. So those are my 5 key stakeholder management strategies. It went a little bit longer than I expected it to because we had some great conversation during. Is there something else that anyone has found is a really powerful stakeholder management strategy that we didn't talk about here today that feels like it should be included as we continue this conversation?
I think everything that's top of mind to me is really a subcategory of your 5. So I think you really nailed that really nicely.
Well, thank you. And the secret is Holly really helped me research this a lot. So thank you, Holly. I'm standing on the back of a great partner there. Thank you very much, Holly. Yeah. All right.
Awesome. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. So that is it for this week in our stakeholder management strategies discussion. Next week, we'll be back with part 2 of our Winning at Stakeholder Relationship series on managing difficult stakeholders. And that's going to be a really fun conversation with some people bringing some stories from the trenches. And we will see you then. So everybody have a great week. Thanks for joining us.